Good morning, everyone. It's a joy to celebrate this Eucharist with you today. Today, our pro-life office in the Knights of Columbus and the Catholic Daughters have organized this pro-life Mass here at the Cathedral. I want to welcome the State Deputy Bob Schwartz, the state officers in fourth degree honor guard, and Nancy Meehan and Linda Coletti, the Catholic Daughters of America, and of course our own Sylvia Fernandez de Castillo, director of our Archdiocesan Pro-Life Office, who just a few months ago organized a beautiful national congreso for the Hispanic community. I just finished reading the latest book by Erik Larson, who is an historian but who writes so well. And the name of the book is The Demon of Unrest, in which he describes the beginning of the Civil War in the United States. And it is a very powerful reflection on the history of our country. I mean, it's often been said that the original sin of America is racism. And that racism was a failure to see in each and every human being something precious. Now, I was bishop for 10 years in the West Indies, and in the island where I was, in the center of the town, was still the vestiges of the slave market. On the neighboring island, when there was a slave rebellion and the King of Denmark sent the Navy to put it down, when the people heard that the soldiers were coming, they committed mass suicide. There were so many signs around us of that terrible history. On St. Croix, you could see the huge balls of lead with chains on them. We use that expression, a ball and chain. Well, that was to keep the recalcitrant slaves there cutting cane in the field so they could not escape. But reading Erik Larson's book, where he talks about 4 million enslaved Americans at that time, and the owners of these slaves considered themselves aristocrats. They had a code of honor. They had a very high civilization. And yet they were blind to one of the most basic truths, and that was that these enslaved people were human beings, and each one of them had the dignity and the right to life and freedom. Sometimes we lose sight of that, and that blindness can even happen to good people. When you read about some of these people who were slave owners, George Washington, he had many great virtues, but he had that blindness there. I wonder if 200 years from now, people look back at our history and see our attitude towards abortion and say, what were they thinking about? Couldn't they see that this is human life? Today's gospel, Jesus is trying to get his apostles to understand his mission. He has gathered the inner circle of his closest collaborators, the apostles, and he tells them for the second time that he's going to be handed over and killed. And they don't understand, and they were afraid to question him. The first time he makes the announcement, St. Peter takes him aside and says, "Oh, don't talk that way." And Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan. You savor of the things of man and not of God." Even St. Peter was blind to the kind of Messiah that Jesus came to be, the suffering servant to redeem us. Not the great military leader who was going to defeat the Romans, and no. Today's gospel is the second prediction of Jesus about his passion. And once again, the response of the apostles shows just how far off base they were. Jesus is presenting himself as the suffering servant about to be sacrificed, and his apostles start arguing over who's going to be the greatest, who's going to have the best portfolios, the first places at the table, the thrones at the right and the left. Jesus embarrasses them by placing a child in their midst. And putting his arms around the child, St. Mark says, he says to them, whoever receives a child such as this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. Well, today the church is calling on all of us to see the importance of every child and every human life. That's part of discipleship. Being pro-life is part of being a disciple. Discipleship is a costly grace, not a cheap grace. That is what Jesus is trying to teach his apostles. Today there is a demonization of the pro-life movement that's trying to politicize and debunk people's desire to protect the most basic human right, the right to life. In the pro-life movement, we must never allow people, especially women, to perceive the pro-life movement as a bunch of angry, self-righteous Pharisees with stones in their hands, looking down on them and ready to judge them. We want women in a difficult pregnancy to experience the merciful love of Christ. Pope Francis urges us to practice the art of accompaniment, which teaches us to remove our sandals before the sacred ground of the other, and in this case, the woman in crisis. This accompaniment must be steady and reassuring, reflecting our closeness and our compassionate gaze, which heals, liberates, and encourages. This is what the Sisters of Life, Project Rachel, and Walking with Moms in Needs are all about. We are here because we want to save thousands of innocent children who are being dispatched by the very people whose mission should be to heal and protect life. The truth is that we can save babies only by saving mothers. When a woman experiences God's loving mercy in the community, then she may be capable of accepting that child. The pro-life movement has to be about saving mothers. We need to focus on the women and try to understand what they are suffering. There are millions of women in our country who have had abortions, and many millions of men who push them to those abortions, encourage them. Cheaper to pay for the abortion than to pay child support, and drove them to the clinics. Wouldn't it be wonderful if some of them could accept St. John Paul II's challenge to those who've chosen abortion to commit themselves to life, whether by accepting the birth of another child, the Holy Father says, or by welcoming and caring for those most in need of someone to be close to them, to become promoters of a new way of looking at human life. One person who did take up that challenge was Dr. Bernard Nathanson, the founder of NARAL, the founder of the pro-abortion movement in the United States. In the 1970s, Dr. Nathanson ran an abortion clinic in New York City, where today half the black children are aborted. His clinic operated from 8 a.m. until midnight. He performed roughly 100 abortions a day. But having promoted abortion and convinced of its urgency, Bernard Nathanson, the tailor who produced the King's New Clothes in the United States, finally heard that child's voice pointing to the inconvenient truth, and his conscience could no longer allow him to fool himself into believing that it was not a human being. Dr. Nathanson became one of the most eloquent opponents of abortion in the abortion industry. In 1982, I invited him to come and speak to the Black and Hispanic leaders in the Archdiocese of Washington at Catholic University. And a few years later, he accompanied me to Honduras, where he presented his film, The Silent Scream, to the medical faculty on national television. He was very instrumental in getting the laws of that country reversed. He spent the rest of his life trying to do the same in the United States. God's grace turned Saul of Tarsus, the great persecutor of the church, into the apostle of the Gentiles, St. Paul. And that same grace transformed Dr. Nathanson, the founder of NARAL, into an apostle of the gospel of life. The antidote for abortion is solidarity, community where people care for each other and for the most vulnerable. The message of the gospel of life, as Pope Francis tells us, is a message of joy. The Holy Father writes, "Those who feel far from God and the Church, and to all who are fearful or indifferent, I would say this: the Lord, with great respect and love, is calling you to be part of his people. The Church must be a place of mercy given freely, where everyone can feel welcomed, loved, forgiven, and encouraged to lead the good life of the gospel. The very heart of the gospel is life in community and engagement with others." The challenge Pope Francis places before our young people is to be evangelizers, but to evangelize with beauty and with joy. The Holy Father says, to communicate the moral teachings that promote growth in the gospel way of life, it's helpful to stress again and again the attractiveness and the ideal of a life of wisdom, self-fulfillment, and enrichment. In light of that positive message, our rejection of the evils which endanger that life can be better understood. Rather than experts in dire predictions, dour judges, bent on rooting out every threat and deviation, we should appear as joyful messengers of challenging proposals, guardians of goodness and beauty that shines forth in a life of fidelity to the gospel. At Lampedusa, Pope Francis cast a wreath into the sea where thousands of poor immigrants lost their lives. He warned about the globalization of indifference. We face this in the pro-life movement. Just as with slavery in the past, today many Americans are repulsed by abortion but believe that it is a necessary evil. Our task is to show them that it is not necessary. It is evil, but it is not necessary. Where there are community and solidarity, more humane solutions present themselves when there's a difficult pregnancy. When the abortion decision of the Supreme Court was handed down, the logical response of the pro-life movement was a call for adoption, not abortion. The truth is, each year there are fewer and fewer adoptions and more abortions. Many young Americans don't know anyone who was adopted, and if they do, it's probably someone from China, Russia, or Guatemala, giving the impression that entrusting a child to an adoptive family is not something Americans do. The history of adoption is not always a glorious one. You may have seen the film of Philomena. It tells the story of a young girl forced to give up her baby. It was a tragic history. We need people to hear the good stories of adoptions, of courageous birth mothers and generous adopted families that have truly provided a loving family for an adopted child. Majority of women who succumb to abortion are poor. Poverty is dehumanizing, and it leads people to feel trapped and to make horrible decisions. The gospel of life demands that we work for economic justice in our country and in the world. A society where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poor, abortion looms ever larger. Planned Parenthood was founded to eliminate the poor by getting rid of them. We can rescue unborn babies from adoption by rescuing their mothers from a life of poverty and hopelessness. Pope Francis challenges our complacency and indifference to the oppressive poverty that spawns so many abortions. Today, the question we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of a world do we want to live in and pass on to future generations? A society fueled by greed, individualism, and hedonism, governed by a precarious balance of power among various interest groups, a society where financial considerations prevail over the common good, where fads and fashions have more appeal than virtue and the spirit of altruism and service. The last century, the 20th century, which was the century of the greatest progress in medicine, technology, science, it was also the most violent century in the history of humanity. It's time to take a long, hard look at the direction that we are taking as a people. Are we building a society where it's easier to be good, where people know the difference between right and wrong? Will we become a people who care about people, especially those who are most vulnerable and suffering at the beginning and at the end of life cycle? Will we make room for all at the table of the Lord? I'm convinced that we must build a civilization of love, or there will be no civilization at all. What should be obvious to all is that business as usual will not do. And we need to begin with, "Thou shalt not kill."